Barbara, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back and continuing the partnership with you and with Chapel Hill and with your now diplomatic initiative, a partnership that began before the name. The American Academy of Diplomacy is a small organization. It is now 40 years old. It was started by people like Henry Kissinger and Ellsworth Bunker. Its members elect other members. We're still only about 400 members, but give you some feeling of the membership in the current administration. Members of the administration who happen to be members of the Academy include the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the head of the CIA, the Undersecretary for Political Affairs in the State Department. So, of course, the problem with that is then we go back to the government, I can't get their dues. So it's a small organization. As it has evolved over the years, it has really two purposes. One is talking to Americans about what diplomacy is, what the reality of it is, because many people would say diplomacy is important, and at that point they would have used up all they knew about the subject. And trying to explain the reality of this as a practical application of practical solutions. The Academy has expanded its membership. We include people who have backgrounds in climate and cyber intelligence. But the common thread is that all the members of the Academy have been practitioners. That is, they have dealt with implementing American policy overseas with foreigners. It's not about policy formation alone. It's about getting other people to do what we think they should be doing in our interest. And that is a big part of our action. And another part of our action is telling the Department of Congress how we think they could do things better. And we do a lot of work with Congress, but that's not the subject for tonight. This particular occasion, the Sisco Forum, is named after Joseph Sisco, former Undersecretary of State and later President of American University. And his family, particularly his daughter, helped the Academy with a challenge grant, and then Academy members came up with the rest of the money and provided an endowment, which now creates this forum once a year where we can bring a very distinguished panel, as we have tonight, I hasten to add, to explore a subject of mutual interest. So we're really happy to be here and in cooperation again, once more, with Chapel Hill. And Barbara, let me turn the program back to you.
I'm going to ask my panelists to come up and sit behind your name tags while I get this panel kicked off. So we have a remarkable panel tonight, and I hope you find this discussion compelling, as each panelist will share his personal experiences as a practitioner of environmental diplomacy. Our panelists will explain what environmental diplomacy is and how it works, and they'll talk about how various actors within our government and beyond work together to address something as monumental and as inherently complex as climate change. Then we're going to move to audience questions shortly after 6 o'clock. So there's mics set up here. You're going to have a chance to ask questions. So be thinking about them. And also I want to mention that when this ends, there's a reception with pizza. Our guests will go out first. I'll remind you of this, but then they'll sit and you'll be able to gather around and have smaller conversations for about another 20 minutes. So I think there will be ample opportunity, I hope, for engagement, direct engagement. I want to mention one more, a plug to next month on March 27 at 7 o'clock on the 4th floor. We plan to co-sponsor an event that a group of UNC students put together. They participated in the most recent UN Conference of the Parties, COP28. And what they found at COP28. If you sign up for our newsletter, we can keep you informed about details of that and our other events. Now, tonight we're going to explore the role of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, or just AID, AID, in combating climate change and mitigating the impact of it. And we'll explore the role of the State Department's Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and International Science in coordinating U.S. government positions and negotiating international agreements. We'll also look specifically at the case of the Just Energy Transition Partnership with Indonesia. Just Energy Transition Partnerships, or JETPs, the JETP talks with Indonesia. Ambassador Blake, who is on tonight's panel, participated very directly in those talks, working with Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. As Bob said, I gave a year of my life to this. Now, having spent 34 years myself as an American diplomat, I must say that the architecture of the sprawling COP process with the JETP talks nestled underneath it has me in awe. Just when I start to fear that the complexities of the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy are so great that they're going to overwhelm our collective capacity to chart a way forward, I learned about the JETP agreement with Indonesia, and I find renewed hope. I hope you find some too. I'm eager to hear more about all of this good work, so let's dive right in. Administrator Fulgham, my first question is for you. Your career is full of private and public experiences managing massive international development programs and projects. For a year, you served as the acting administrator of USAID, which is the head of that agency. Now, I worked closely with aid through my 34 years in the Foreign Service, including my years as ambassador to Panama, and during the war in El Salvador, when the aid mission played this really, really important role in bringing that to a peaceful end. So how does USAID bring together the public and private sectors to develop strategy and policy? And what role does the agency play in implementing U.S. environmental strategy and policy?
Barbara, thank you for having us tonight. It's great to be here at UNC with all these young erudites in the room, hopefully future diplomats. I think it's a very good question, Barbara. I think that when we look at the world as it is right now, we've got to feed 50% more people by 2050. We've got urban population is going to be 60% in the world. People are living in cities. We've got 90 million refugees around the world, 90 million. And so when we look at food security as an issue in regards to climate, how are we going to manage those things? One of the things that the U.S. Agency for International Development is responsible for is nature investments, nature tourism, trying to find a way, solutions that are similar, that support local communities, bringing the local communities back into the fold and helping them to manage climate change within their communities. I think we have to be much more empathetic about how we manage climate change. I think we as the biggest polluters here in the United States, one of the big polluters, have to go at this issue with much more empathy and working at the local level to a point where we make them feel like they have buy-in to this process. I think we have a lot of work to do on the agricultural side. I talked about climate in general.
Microphone on?
The mic, I think it is. Can you hear me?
No, we're going to get your mic.
No, it's on.
Or you can just hold it.
Can you hear me now? No, no. Can you hear me now? It's like a commercial.
Try that.
Hello, we're there?
Yeah, they're much better.
I'm sorry. Let me just go back through it real quick. I talked about nature investments and looking at the strategies that the U.S. government has taken on to address climate change. I talked about locally led sustainable solutions and adaptability in climate change. I think those things are very important to the work that the U.S. Agency for International Development is involved in. Locally led solutions, private sector involvement. We have to stop being allergic to the word private sector. They help play a major role in our ability to scale and manage problems at the local level. Most importantly, the agency has always been involved with trying to manage risk systemically across the board to make sure we do no harm. And every project that AID is involved in, they do what they call a management assessment, environmental impact assessment to address the programs that we're implementing, that they cause no harm in the communities. When you look at the work we've done in water, We had a strategy from 2022 to 2027. Aaron Salzberg is in the audience, who helped put together the first water strategy for the U.S. government. We've all played a role in those things in order to move us forward and get us to think strategically about our resources as we move forward.
Thank you so much. And Assistant Secretary Rock, my next question is for you. You began your career in public service as a scientist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. You spent the following decades as a diplomat in the State Department. The State Department oversees the world's second largest network of embassies and consulates, behind only China. And it's organized into multiple bureaus, both geographically based, like Africa and Western Hemisphere affairs, and issue-based, such as the Bureau for Oceans, Environment, Science, Technology, and Health, which you led. You have suggested in the past that the department should establish a Bureau for Environmental Diplomacy. True? How does the State Department integrate across cross-cutting agency and bureaucratic issues to craft environmental agreements that can be pursued bilaterally and with multiple nations? And just describe for us your work on environmental diplomacy. Let's try your lavalier mic
Let's see if
first.
this, can you hear me from this one?
Okay.
Okay, I think we're not. Hold on, let's see if the light's on now. We're not hearing, we're still not hearing. Okay, let's wait for the microphone. So because we are melding together several topics here as one, let me first start with a little anecdote. It is true that I had a circuitous route to the environmental diplomacy in the State Department, but I actually began when I was much younger. My first real introduction to multilateral diplomacy was as a representative of a non-governmental organization working on the delegation to the UN Conference of the Law of the Sea. One afternoon, I'm walking through the delegates lounge at UN headquarters, and I see over in the corner the then head of delegation, U.S. delegation, at that time was Elliot Richardson, for those of you who pursue history. And sitting next to him was the head of the Soviet delegation. And we happened to be at a point where we had some very sensitive negotiations going on between the U.S. and a group of nations led by the Soviets. Now, they were sitting at a small table with drinks in hand, 2 pens and a napkin, and they were at work. And my conclusion at that point was, so this is how diplomacy is done. You're in a lounge with drinks in hand, pens and a napkin. And I didn't begin to appreciate at that point the complexity of the process, the mechanics associated with multilateral diplomacy. And lo and behold, many years later, I am heading a bureau which is responsible for 92 treaties, agreements, and various protocols. I think what I learned in that process was that that multilateral diplomacy is certainly, it is a serious initiative. When you are representing your country in multilateral negotiations, you need to treat it seriously. And there's certain skills that we focus on that are aiming mostly at whether you can anticipate the challenges in a multiple chess player type of an environment. I think that the only way that you get to know what the nearly 8 billion people on this planet care about global challenges is to allow their national representatives to have a forum in which to have these discussions. And that forum, the United Nations General Assembly or the related conferences, is that forum. The one thing that was unique for me in the OES Bureau was that I was closer to my constituents than maybe some others in the State Department were in that regard, because the strong domestic agenda, the strong vocal determination that was coming on this issue from our domestic colleagues was a driver for how we approach the international dialogues. Just a quick word about the multilateral environmental agreements themselves. When they were first being negotiated in the modern era, in the post-World War II era, the dominant theme was threat. Even before we speak about environment, threat, controlling atomic energy, managing the rise of global disease, managing food supplies worldwide, dealing with challenges that were going on in the atmospheric environment. All of these were issues that drove negotiations. Over time, we began to see what you hear so much more about now, universal challenges, human rights issues, poverty reduction issues, gender equality issues. Incorporating those dynamics into fundamental environmental agreements is a challenge, and we are getting better at it. I say this only because if you look at the progression, environmental agreements are a good example. If you look at the progression of these multilateral agreements, initially, our goal with an environmental agreement was to preserve or to manage natural resources. That's why in the early 70s and prior, you saw agreements on endangered species, on marine environment, on air pollution, on a range of topics that were designed to control those natural resources. It wasn't until the 1972 conference on humans and the environment that we began to say there is a human factor here. There is a driver in this that we need to pay attention to. And what emerged from that process was the dynamic of dialogue between industrialized countries and the developing world on economic growth versus ecological degradation. That came to a crescendo by the time we got into the 1990s, and we said, what is it that we're trying to achieve here? What's that space in between? And that space became known as sustainable development. It is in this region that we realized that we cannot negate the development, but we need to do it in a sustainable fashion. Now, you mentioned at the beginning climate change as a driver. Let me just, in summation, make this point to all of you out there who see this entire agenda as being climate driven. I can appreciate that for some of you, climate may be defined as whether or not you're losing your beachfront property in the Outer Banks. That is certainly an issue. But for others around the world, it is famine, it's drought, it's economic disruption, it's forced migration, it's transboundary tension. There are a variety of different ways in which you can approach this issue. If I could invite you for a moment to just not speak specifically about climate change, but look at other environmental dynamics. Think, for example, about countries that have fundamentally opposing ideologies in the Middle East, for example, but have common requirements for managing resources. Or conversely, countries that are all bordering a river like the Mekong, but have vastly different uses for that water, from hydropower to fisheries to flooding the rice paddies. Or consider the issues associated with introducing genetically modified organisms into agriculture, or pulling out pesticides for countries whose food stocks are so vital. These kinds of changes, these kinds of modifications blend environment with economic and social and cultural dynamics. That is the fundamental components here, and they are difficult measures for us to bring together ultimately. Why do we do it? We do it because global instability is not in the U.S. security interest. Stability through environments and through an understanding of norms and standards that support it makes the globe more stable and makes us more secure. How are we doing? In most of these multilateral environmental agreements that I've described, I would say we are doing very well at blending and recognizing the interrelatedness of environmental priorities. We're beginning to understand that when we work on a hazardous waste issue, it's also a health issue, and it's also a coastal states issue. We're understanding that. Not doing as well on the social and the economic dynamics of this. And that's where I think our emphasis needs to be in the future, where we are successful in, for example, ensuring in trade that we have comparability in terms of fair competition and environmental rules applied uniformly. We have so many other ways in which to address the social and cultural sensitivities associated with environmental agreements. A lot of work to do there. It's your job to help us do it. So I hope you will.
Thank you, Bud. And now my next question, this could be my last one, we'll see, is for Ambassador Blake. You served as the U.S. Ambassador to Indonesia, the fourth most populous country in the world, and with one of the highest levels of biodiversity anywhere, second only to Brazil. Indonesia exports more coal than any other country, but it's also rich in minerals like nickel, which is critical to a global transition to clean energy. So for these reasons and many more, Indonesia is crucial to the global response to climate change. It's an ideal partner for U.S. environmental diplomacy efforts. So, Bob, can you tell us about the Just Energy Transition Partnership in Indonesia, which you played this strategic role in negotiating, and tell us why it matters and how you did it?
Well, first of all, I didn't do it. I was part of a very large team that did it, but I'm very, very glad to be here. It's great to see so many young people. If I have two messages for all of you guys, particularly the young people, it's one, climate change is a difficult problem, but there are a lot of really great solutions that are underway now. And so I want you to leave this room with hope in your eyes. And secondly, as we talk about environmental diplomacy, more and more we're living in a multipolar world. And so more and more environmental diplomacy is about creating coalitions. And one of those coalitions that I'll talk about today is the Just Energy Transition Partnership, as we call it, by JETP. So just a little bit of background. As Barbara said, I was the U.S. ambassador in Indonesia from 2013 to 2016, which was just before the famous Paris climate negotiations took place in 2015. So then Secretary of State John Kerry tasked me with figuring out how to reduce Indonesia's greenhouse gas emissions even then. So we came up with a very big sustainable palm oil initiative that I'd certainly be happy to talk about in the Q&A. But he remembered that, and as he was getting ready to work on this JETP, he called me up and he said, you know, I've got a lot of really smart mid-level technocrats who work for me, but I don't have anybody who can get in to see a minister. And more importantly, I don't have anybody who enjoys the trust that we need within the Indonesian government to get this to fruition. So I said, I'd be glad to do it. So I worked really half-time for the better part of a year to help bring this home. So first of all, why Indonesia? You know, Kerry has a relatively small staff. I mean, there's just really a handful of people working for him. So they had to be very strategic about where they were going to spend their time and where they were going to spend the limited U.S. government resources. And so he decided he was going to pick the very largest countries in the world that did not have good net zero 2050 targets yet, but that were huge were in the top 10 or 15 greenhouse gas emitters in the world, but also countries that were willing to work with us and really undertake really serious regulatory and other commitments in order to achieve these ambitions. And also countries that were strategically important to us. So as Barbara mentioned, Indonesia, fourth largest country in the world, the largest Muslim majority democracy in the world, but also a country that has a growing economy and is going to be probably in the top 4 or 5 economies in the world by 2050, because they still have a relatively young population. So for all those reasons, a very important country to work with. And if we could succeed there, it would be quite a useful template for other countries. So what was the JETP? The JETP was basically an agreement that the US and Japan negotiated on behalf of a whole bunch of G7 countries who were going to be donors as well, and then also on behalf of 6 major private banks. The ultimate agreement was $10 billion in finance from all the various governments, and then $10 billion in private finance from these 6 banks. And that group may increase over time. And under the agreement, Indonesia committed to peak its total power sector emissions by 2050, so the famous net zero deployment of renewables. When I had arrived in Indonesia in 2013, they didn't even have a renewable energy goal. So I pushed them hard to develop one. They did have one, but then from there, we got them to double that in this agreement. And I just to give you a little bit of a sense of how hard this was. I mean, these were major commitments that we were asking them to make, first of all. So, you know, Indonesia, like a lot of countries, there's a lot of nationalism. And there were a lot of people inside the country who chafed at that and who were not terribly happy that the United States and Japan were pushing their government to do more on something like this. So we had to deal with that, and that's where this issue of trust came in. Secondly, as Barbara mentioned, coal is a hugely important part of the Indonesian economy still. It's still their major source of power. And so the coal barons in Indonesia are very, very well entrenched, and we could be very sure that they were going to continue to resist our efforts to reduce coal-fired power plants and to increase renewable energy. So we had that to deal with. And so we had to work really pretty quietly behind the scenes. And frankly, having the Japanese as our co-partners in this was very, very important, because the Japanese are much more polite than we Americans are, and they have a lot of trust in Indonesia. They're a very big donor of not only in terms of concessional aid, but also in terms of their banks. So they were really an ideal partner. We worked very closely with them. And I have to say, we had a lot of really tough issues. One was just skepticism on the part of the government that we could deliver $20 billion in finance. They were worried about our own. They saw the problems that we were experiencing in our own Congress, and that House Republicans were resisting foreign aid of any kind. But they were also very worried that the banks were going to be able to deliver $10 billion in assistance. So one of the really important things that we did was to organize a huge Zoom conference where we got senior vice presidents of all these banks in the same room in a Zoom with all the key ministers of Indonesia. And one by one, they went down the list, the banks did, and described their net zero 2050 targets and how they are looking for renewable projects that they could finance. And so Indonesia, a $10 billion opportunity was just a major, major opportunity for them. And so I think after that, it really helped to dispel a lot of the skepticism that the Indonesians had that the private sector was going to be able to deliver on that. So that was a big sort of milestone in the negotiations. The other really tough ones were a lot of the regulatory reforms that had to take place. And I'll just give you one example. Indonesia for many years has had local content requirements on solar, where anybody who needed to invest had to have at least 40% local content, which was in fact impossible because very little in terms of solar panels or anything else was actually produced in Indonesia. And so there were a lot of cynics who believed that that was set intentionally high precisely to prevent those consumed many, many hours of debate and travel and so forth. But in the end, I think it was the promise of $20 billion in finance that brought everybody to the table. And this was then announced by President Jokowi when in the famous Bali G20 summit that Indonesia happened to be hosting. So, there's a rotating presidency of the G20, and so Indonesia was hosting it that year. So, and now the agreement is progressing. Now the really hard part is taking place, which is how do we actually tee up projects that can be financed by either the G7 countries, or preferably by the private sector, or by a combination of a blended finance. I should also say that an important role is being played by a lot of the big philanthropies. So the Bezos Fund, the MacArthur, Bloomberg, several others, Rockefeller. And so all of them are there on the sidelines and ready to come in and play a role as well. And all of them attach a great deal of importance to climate now. So that was probably an overly long answer to a short question, but that's a brief summary of the JETP.
Talk to me a little bit about bringing in the World Bank, the IMF, the International Energy Agency, and did AID play a role?
Yeah, so first on sort of multilateral front, probably the key partners going forward are going to be the multilateral development banks. In Indonesia's case, the Asian Development Bank. So in everything we did, we coordinated very closely with them. And indeed, they had their own separate, what they call energy transition mechanism initiative going, which was to establish a template for accelerating the decommissioning of coal-fired power plants in Indonesia. So there's one in particular that they're now working on. And again, once that's concluded, that will then serve as a template for hopefully for others to follow. So the ADB is an enormously
and has an Indonesian club and an Indonesian husband.
I think it does work. So I'm going to leave this one with you. We will use this one on the side if anyone has questions on this side, okay?
I don't think it's.
If you have a question, make your way into the aisles to Emmy or behind Kevin, so we know you've got a question. Go ahead, Kevin.
Thank you all so much. This was fantastic. You've talked to us a lot about getting to the agreements, and thank you for the amazing work you've done to get there. With great respect to the row of Indonesians that I'm sitting with, in Indonesia, sometimes the hardest part is not getting to the agreement. It's carrying out the agreement, holding the other side accountable that they're going to do their bit, right? Ambassador Blake, I'm sure that you know all of these comprehensive partnership things that we've said. We make a checklist of who's done what on their side, and one side gets checked off and one side does not. In environmental diplomacy, it's not getting them to do it. It's the accurate reporting to make sure we've done it, right? How do we monitor in a foreign country who's allowed to monitor that stuff? So can y'all talk a little bit on that implementation side, right? Once we've gotten to that agreement, how are we able to check? How are we able to follow up?
Well, that's a super question, Kevin. First of all, let me just, pivot off your question. What you just said applies to the entire world. In the COP process, what we found is that countries make these grandiose commitments, but a very small percentage of them have actually implemented what they've pledged to do so far. So at the last COP, there was a recognition of that. And so there's going to be, I think, much greater attention to what have countries actually done to implement their existing, because I think it's roughly 12% are currently on track with the commitments that they've made at COP. The main thing we're asking of the Indonesians, one is, are these various regulatory reforms that are going to allow for these projects to then move forward. So that's a huge piece of it. And then it's the political will to allow, for example, to push back on the coal barons who are going to surely resist a lot of these things. And that's going to be, frankly, a lot of work behind the scenes to do that. And then the job is on us to actually tee up projects. And so I think and a lot of that is happening. So Many of you may have heard of the Trade and Development Agency. That's another agency. And what they do is they fund feasibility studies for projects. So they've funded a feasibility study for a wind project in West Nusa Tenggara, which is an island just east of Bali. So that's a very practical, wind project that can move forward. And we're going to hold PLN, which is the state-owned enterprise that runs these projects, to account and make sure that that this moves forward, that there will be appropriate tariffs so that this can generate revenues, that there will be appropriate that the whole process of negotiating a power purchase agreement will not take 2 years, which is what the average is now, that it can be done in a much quicker fashion. So there's a whole series of things that have to be done to on both sides to make this work. And as you say, it's not easy. But so there's a combination of sort of little projects like this wind power project, and then some truly big ideas. So one of the big ideas that they've been talking about is to link the central Java-Bali grid and establish an extension transmission line up to the northern island of Sumatra, so that you would be able to share surplus electricity from Java with electricity deficit Sumatra, which would be, and it's not that hard. It's not really that far. So that's the kind of big idea that I think would be quite interesting, and again, could attract commercial financing.
Just one other quick point that may be self-evident, but I think it would be naive to assume that when on the global scale we set targets, that we assume that all countries are going to meet those targets going in. We know that is unrealistic. So when we look at this at the UN scale, at the global scale, there tends to be a packaging, if you will, of countries in somewhat like conditions, economically, socially, et cetera. So once a country is within that section, how they are making progress toward the agreement or toward the target is very, very important, because the signal that they want to send and the signal that most donors are looking for is, did you make a commitment? Did you try? Are you making an effort? Are you setting a framework? Are you doing assessments? Do you understand your situation? And if they are able to say, if countries are able to say, we're 20% toward our target, or we're 30% toward our target, you are setting the goals for donor countries or donor organizations to make up that difference. It's that initial commitment and where you are relative to, if you will, your geographical peers that is defining in terms of how we make progress.
Let me just add one other piece here. I think we're going to have to continue to look at the multilateral banks as being the key to the future of us solving the climate change issues. I look at Papua New Guinea. We've been able to, through a project through USAID, set aside 100 million acres of forestry in Papua New Guinea. I think regionally we're going to have to attack these problems, but we need indicators that are in place that allow for us to measure. If we don't measure, everybody's not going to always meet the agreement. I agree with you. We're not always going to get there. But I think we have to put indicators in place that give us something to reach for. And if we don't do that, we're stuck at neutral. Also, the DFC is playing a major role in climate. And I think that the United States has been a little slow off the mark on that. And I think over the next couple of years, you'll see Exim Bank as well doing some things in climate. But I think we're moving in the right direction. But it's going to take the multilateral banks as well as our development banks to really make this work forward.
Thanks for that, Alonzo. And I just want to do a plug here. The former administrator of the Agency for International Development has just underscored that you have to get baseline metrics and be able to measure progress if you're really going to make progress on this. All of you who are Tar Heels, I want you to know that the Population Center at the University of North Carolina has got one of the best metrics programs that is anywhere in the world. It's a program called Measure, and you should look it up. It gets like a download from every country in the world. It's a resource this university made available and developed it. So take a look at it. And then if you're really interested in this work, figuring out the metrics, how do you get the baseline and show movement is such an underappreciated part of solving the problem that Kevin raised, which is that everybody makes promises, but do we know if we're making any progress? There's a chance to become a real expert on this at Carolina.
Can I just make one more point? For those of you who are sort of real JETP nerds, the Rockefeller Foundation has just come out with a quite interesting study, sort of looking ahead to the next generation of JETPs and how they should be structured. And I'd really because the governance piece of this is really, really important. And corruption is still rampant in many of these countries. And that too is a very important issue that's got to be dealt with.
All right, we're going to have to do shorter answers, but that was such a good question. Let's take our first question from this side, then we'll come to you, Atina.
Hello, my name is Tom Wee. Indonesia, are there any actors that are interested in thorium, nuclear power? I know that China and India are developing that. So I wonder if that's going on in Indonesia. That's my first question. And the second question is, I've always wondered, with all the pollution from motorbikes that's used by the middle class, why doesn't somebody invent or promote electrical bicycles in Indonesia? Thank you.
I'll keep my answer short. Thorium is still relatively experimental. I think what's really being focused on now are the small modular reactors, SMRs. And so there is already a project underway that's, well, soon to be underway in Kalimantan to hopefully deploy an SMR. I think a lot of people feel, myself included, that SMRs are a great solution for a lot of these big mineral processing projects that need clean energy. And it's going to be very difficult to deploy solar at scale. So maybe bringing in, several small modular reactors could be a solution to that. And we already have a 1, 2, 3 agreement with Indonesia that allows nuclear cooperation like this. So that would be good. On your question about e-bikes, already they are electrifying the scooters. I haven't seen so many e-bikes so far. I think that's still a relatively new thing, but just getting the e-scooters going will be important. There's still a lot of work to be done in terms of charging infrastructure in Indonesia, which is still pretty rudimentary. So I think that needs to be a focus. And of course, it's the same in our country. We need to do more as well in our country.
Thank you. And Atina, on this side, please.
Hi, thank you to being here. My name is Atina. I'm a MBA candidate at Kenan Fogger, and I'm from Indonesia. I also work in energy industry, so I get it. Know like what you're talking before. And my question is, before my question, I will say to the last questioner that in Indonesia, we already, the government has like incentive for every people that want to buy electric motorcycle or electric bike. So it's kind of like they have it like in the last 2 or like 3 years in Indonesia to increase the electric vehicles used in Indonesia. And so my question is, if we talk about renewable energy transition, we need to talk about the financial impact, the economics impact. So Indonesian nickels is on the process of downstreaming, and half of the world are concerned about this. It's a hot debate right now. Because of the supply chain disruption in the world, and also because of the increased use of the coal. So the nickels use a lot of coals right now. Meanwhile, it will bring huge advantage for Indonesia, increase the value of the nickels that we have. Also, it will drive the economics of Indonesia. So my question is, how is diplomacy can solve the problem for win-win solution for the Indonesian finance or like economics, also for the half of the world that will concern about the environment, also about the supply chain. Thank you.
Okay, that's a big question. I'll try to answer it in as succinctly as possible. As you know, there's great concern in Washington about growing Chinese control of green supply chains, including nickel. And there's also great concern that over time, Indonesia is the low-cost producer of nickel, so it's driven many of the other countries out of business. But that's had the effect of actually increasing Chinese control because most of the Indonesian nickel processing is done by Chinese companies. So it's a little bit of a conundrum. I think the answer is for the United States and Indonesia to conclude what's called a critical minerals agreement, because we are not a free trade partner of Indonesia so far. We don't have a free trade agreement. And only those countries with free trade agreements are eligible to have their nickel receive tax relief under the Inflation Reduction Act. So again, the answer is to allow for a critical mineral agreement. But right now, there's a lot of resistance on Capitol Hill in Congress because of low labor and environmental standards in Indonesia, mostly because these are being done by Chinese companies who don't really respect labor and environmental laws. So my argument to my friends in the administration is we should set minimum labor and environmental standards for projects. And then we should also try to encourage some sort of green energy minimums to accelerate the deployment of renewables. So I think that's the way forward. But right
China? Like, is it a necessity for US to collaborate with China, or can it also opt for in competition with China? And which approach would be the best for the US environmental movement? Thank you.
Down. Who wants to answer first?
I'll start since you asked
General.
about Prabowo. I think Prabowo, the reason Prabowo got elected was that he pledged continuity with Jokowi's policies. Jokowi, as you know, has an 80% approval rating. And so, and Prabowo, of course, was a member of his cabinet as defense minister. So he broadly pledged continuity. He wants to continue to try to raise growth rates in Indonesia. And part of that, if you're going to raise growth rates from 5% to say 6% or 7%, you've got to continue to diversify the economy, which they've done successfully with the digital economy and now the downstream processing. So they've got to continue to that process. So I think it's likely that he will try to continue the downstreaming policy and perhaps move it not just into nickel, but into things like bauxite and things like that. So that would be my guess. It's possible that he might be more autocratic, but I don't think it's going to impact that piece of the strategy going forward. On the question of Chinese companies, that's a big question. We're not going to see the U.S. and Chinese companies cooperating because they have such incredibly different business models. And indeed, we are in strong competition now. So there, as you know, the Chinese have been promoting their Belt and Road Initiative. And so a lot of these projects that are taking place in Indonesia fall under the Belt and Road Initiative. It has many advantages. Let's be clear about that they can bring projects to fruition very, very quickly. They bring the financing. It's sort of a one-stop shop that American and European and Japanese companies cannot match. But there's also a lack of transparency. These tend to be state-owned enterprise to state-owned enterprise deals that encourage corruption, for example. The terms, the financing, and so forth are never really publicly disclosed. So there are, and then of course the labor and environmental standards that we've already talked about. So there's some downsides as well. So the United States, Japan, and the Quad countries are thinking about things like the Partnership for Growth of Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, which is a smaller but important and more transparent alternative for financing infrastructure projects in Asia. And so I think that's going to be the angle that the United States will pursue. I should say, we do want to cooperate with China at the COP level. It's very, very important for the United States and China to be working together on this. And that was really the heart of the 2015 Paris deal, was the US and China working together and setting some very important targets of their own that we then asked other countries to try to match in terms of ambition. So I very much hope we will do more at a government-to-government level in terms of getting other countries to do more and to implement what they've already pledged.
Let's go ahead and take your question, and then I think we'll take one more on this side as well. So could you ask your question, please?
Sure, yeah. Thanks so much for your time. And I think a lot of the companies are increasingly offshoring the pollution-heavy or pollution-intensive parts of their value chain to countries throughout Asia and Southeast Asia and in Africa. And I'm wondering, what can we do and there's conflicting evidence of whether offshoring production is increasing pollution. So I wanted to know, what do you think of that issue? Is that an issue as well? What American companies are doing, where there are less costs of pollution and less regulations in offshoring pollution, and what can be done to make sure that American companies and the United States is also holding its end of promises?
We had Catherine Tai here in September. She's the U.S. trade representative and she talked about the ongoing effort, and it hasn't actually come to fruition yet. So I want to put that marker down there. This is an aspiration that isn't yet realized, but for the European Union and the United States to do a joint agreement on two big polluters, steel and aluminum, and to actually require higher tariffs if they were produced in a dirty means with a very, very high carbon emissions, right? So it was a way of using market power in terms of buying it to actually drive down the carbon emissions. So it's been ongoing with the EU. It has not been concluded. It's difficult in an election year to get a trade agreement through, but that would be one model of it where you actually don't allow free access into our markets if the means of production that was offshore is actually very dirty. So it is a focus of this administration and the United States Trade Representative. It's on the Diplomacy Initiative Diplomatic Discussions webpage. You can see her talking about it. Great question. You, sir? Did you?
Can I just add? I mean, I gave the example of nickel and how the U.S. Congress is worried about exactly these issues. So there is a form of accountability even in the U.S. Congress on these issues because they're tracking these because our labor unions and others care about them. The other thing are shareholders. Increasingly you're seeing a great deal of shareholder activism, not just on climate issues, although that is important, but on some of these other environmental issues as well. So, they are trying to hold these companies, if they're dirty environmental records, more accountable.
A final point on that. What makes this unique in a unique situation is it's not pitting the United States versus other countries of the world. It's literally pitting company against company in the United States. So to meet your obligations and to be recognized for meeting your environmental goals or whatever and be challenged by another American company who is offshoring is something that we're trying to get a level playing field for.
Right.
Y'all have repeatedly mentioned regional development banks. What are they?
Adhere to a higher standard, and it reduces the global progress in these areas. So as donors, we have a relationship with the regional banks. As beneficiaries, those governments have a relationship with the regional banks. And ultimately, they're just trying to circulate and provide the resources that they can.
Well, name three regional banks, three regional development banks that are under the World Bank system.
So the ones that stand out most actively are the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, as primary movers in regions that need it the most. We might just say a little bit about how official development assistance relates to the banks. There are certainly instances where we have to do a balance between a loan arrangement and a grant arrangement or something of that sort, but they aren't the only suppliers of resources, in other words.
I think what's most important is that the regional banks provide access to project financing where they normally would not be able to have access with the commercial banks within the region. I think it's a system that needs to be overhauled a little bit and make it more progressive and less clubby. But I think in the long run, it provides an opportunity for countries to move their economies along the development continuum. And I think that's absolutely perfect. It's a process by which we're able to do things in a different way, but be more effective and intentional about making projects move forward in an expeditious way.
And I wonder if you would agree with this about the value of the World Bank and the regional banks. We think of them as loaning out money, but what I found when I was ambassador to Panama is that they were repositories of best practice. Panama was trying to reduce corruption in its economy so it could continue to move up to being a medium high income country. And the World Bank put in a program called Panama Compra, Panama Buys, that was an online government procurement system. And they had developed it by working with governments all over. I'm finding increasingly that one of the real values of the World Bank system is the best practice that it has in helping governments achieve their goals. Would you agree?
I think you're absolutely right. And the other thing is that in some of the areas that we're discussing here today, some of these environmental issues, it takes a little while for countries to recognize the primary, secondary, and tertiary impact of anything that they do in those areas. So how do we get them started in that process? Well, one of the things that the World Bank has provided is that they have individual trust funds within the bank itself, so that if a group of donor countries say, you know, we really care about water issues, so we will establish a trust fund. We will donate to this trust fund. And then if you as a country want to test an idea, the sort of the feasibility notion of it, smaller amounts of money, still substantial, you are able to get off the ground and decide whether or not this reaches a level of viability that you should make a larger request to the World Bank. And I'll tell you this, the United States loves trust funds because they have more control over it than they do over the larger World Bank system. So everybody's a winner there.
So thanks for that question. And I just want to say thanks for all of the great questions. It was the best part of the talk. This discussion is exactly what we wanted the diplomacy initiative to be about and these diplomatic discussions. It's really a way to bring foreign affairs practitioners to Chapel Hill to give you guys a firsthand solution and how to find solutions to global challenges. So thank you all for joining us tonight. So could I ask for you to join me in a round of applause for our panelists? Now, the magic word, of course, is pizza in the atrium, but not just yet, because we're going to give us just a moment to get our panelists out into the atrium. They'll sit down and create a circle where you can join them, and then just let them walk out, and then please, if you would all come follow them. Let me do the thank yous. Thanks again to the American Academy of Diplomacy and to Ambassador Newman for organizing this really insightful Sisco Forum. And don't forget, March 27, 7 o'clock, we're going to have a student-led panel on participating in COP28. And that's it. We'll get our panelists out in the atrium, and then we'll all have a chance to talk. Thank you.